Welcome to Advent Conversations with Good Samaritan Church in Pinellas Park, Florida. Well, Jean and Sue, thank you again for being with us today. And today we're going to talk about the women who are named in Jesus' lineage in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, women are almost never named in lineages in the Bible, so we know that Matthew must have chosen to do this with a very specific intention in mind as he developed the story of Jesus. And today we're talking about Ruth. We're talking about one of two women in the entire Bible for which an entire book of the Bible is named. Who is Ruth? What is her story?
It's really an interesting story, first, because in those times, family was preserved not by the wives, but by the patriarchy. And here we have an old widow and a non-Israeli daughter-in-law. But I think it's important to know that Ruth is a Moabite, and to know who the Moabites were. They were the tribe that was actually born out of the incest of Lot and his oldest brother, after you probably remember the story of his wife turning into a pillar of salt, and he had sex with his daughter. And ever after that, Moabites, particularly Moabite women, were often seen as loose women or women of not the best character. But what brought her into the story is when a couple left Bethlehem, our city of bread, which suddenly didn't have much bread. Bethlehem was going through a famine. And so Elimelech and his wife Naomi apparently were wealthy, and because they had enough money to leave in a time of famine. And so they took off and they went to Moab. And as they lived there, they had two sons who married two of these Moabite women. One of them Orpah and one of them Ruth. And Ruth and her marriage, we kind of start the story after she's been married about 10 years and has had no children. And so the assumption is that she is barren and will never have children. Suddenly, her husband dies, his brother dies, and her father-in-law dies. And she and the other wife, Moabite wife, are left with their mother-in-law, Naomi. I'll let you take it from there.
So Naomi does have relatives still back in Bethlehem, and their only hope to survive, because they had no men to care for them, was to go back where the men were. So at the border between Moab and Israel, they have this just phenomenal conversation. Ruth says, I'll go back with you. And Orpah isn't as responsive. And Naomi tries to say, don't come. There's no future for you. There are no brothers, which would ordinarily be the ones who would be their next husbands. And Ruth does this beautiful, I will go where you go, your God will be my God. And Orpah returns home and Naomi follows her mother-in-law. And then when they get back to Jerusalem, they find one of the old homes, and they're still faced with the issue of food and famine.
Not really, I don't think.
Well, it's hard to tell. There is food. Go ahead.
Because she heard there was bread there once more, which was one reason she went. And then they said they arrived at the time of the barley harvest, which was a good sign, because barley is a type of bread, barley bread, I think.
But because she was a single woman, a widow, she didn't have any income. She had to beg for the food, in essence, or connect. So kind of to collapse the story, she sends Ruth eventually with a brother-in-law, basically, Boaz, who owns the huge barley fields, is a very wealthy man. And she gets Ruth to seduce him. She gives her instruction. She gets out in the fields, and is part of the gleaning, and gleaning is what people who don't have a real job do. They follow the real workers and collect the scraps and bring those home.
Right.
But when Naomi connects her with Boaz, she tells her to go to sleep on the threshing floor at night, where the men, including Boaz, sleep during the day at night, to uncover his feet, which there's a
euphemism.
there's a metaphor, right? And euphemism. Get under his skirt. And when he gets up in the morning to tell her story, and it's like a proposal of marriage almost, or a connect. It's a way to connect. And she puts herself well. And when he wakes up, he recognizes her and has heard the wonderful stories of how she's caring for her mother-in-law, and gives her an honored place among the gleaners, and actually sends a lot of food home with them.
Yeah. And it does say he scattered the seed, which also means he scattered the seed in other ways. But he had noticed her. What impressed me, he had noticed her even before her mother-in-law sent her there, because she was such a hard worker. And he asked then, because she was a Moabite woman, he advised her, stay with the other women where you're safe.
Right,
and I
safe,
think he was he's such a good man from the very beginning, and protective of her. And I like that. But anyway,
there's a lot of cultural kind of norms at play in all of this too. When your husband died, as Ruth and Orpah's husbands did, you were supposed to return back to your parents. But Ruth decides to go ahead with this kind of non-traditional thing and kind of bind herself to her mother-in-law and commit to caring for her and being her family.
Yeah.
And then we also see that the fields, there's this, ancient Israelite custom of leaving the edges of the fields for the widows and the orphans, for those who were the most vulnerable and in need. And so, and they hear that the house of bread is the house of bread again, and they go back and they start gleaning. And that's how Boaz notices Ruth. And of course, there's another family member too, right, that was actually closer related.
Yes.
There's a whole Levirate marriage thing where the closest relative, if a woman's spouse died, was supposed to marry her and produce an heir. And he won't do it. And so Boaz ends up stepping up in the end, even though he really wasn't the next of kin.
And he really receives her almost as part of property, right? I mean, he goes along with the land, is the deal in that. But
But all along the way, Boaz is blessing her. As the Lord lives, this is your faith. He recognizes the risk that she's taken and her faith.
And I think that her faith is really important on the turning point with Naomi as well, because Naomi doesn't want her to go at first. And I think, and the other daughter-in-law goes, which I think is fine that she went. I mean, she went to her family.
Realistic.
I don't think she should be judged in that. But, she kind of really doesn't want Ruth to come, for whether she's just feeling so sorry for her. And then I started wondering, well, is she embarrassed to go back there with a Moabite daughter-in-law? Maybe she's kind of embarrassed of Ruth. I don't know. But to me, the turning point was, where you go, I go, well, when she said, your God is my God. And to me, that is what shifted everything, when she said, I worship the same God. And it said, Naomi said nothing anymore. So, and that was also something I think Boaz recognized. So,
and of course, after they get rid of this other relative, and Boaz has legal, official responsibility for her. The pregnancy that comes from their relationship, of course, is the child who will be the grandfather of David, great grandfather.
As we're talking about kind of that turning point in the story, and we know, here Ruth pledges herself to Naomi and commits to being with her, and then they get back to Bethlehem, and Naomi just dips into this huge depression, really.
Mhm.
Do you remember some of the names in the story? Because the names really
Yeah.
help us to know right
Yeah.
from the start of the story of Ruth that it's going to be this story all about these grand reversals.
Yeah.
What are some of the names in the
Yeah.
story?
Well,
Well,
Elimelech, my God is king.
yeah.
God is my king, my God is king.
And then the husbands, Milan, sickness, Killian, spent.
Mm-hmm.
And the other wife, Orpah, back of the neck, because she turned her back on Naomi.
Yeah,
And
so
Naomi means pleasant.
Mhm.
And Ruth, or it could be, and she takes her name when she gets back,
Mhm.
call me Mara,
Yeah.
which means bitter or
Mhm.
bitterness. Yeah.
right,
Mhm.
Naomi literally changes names through the story from Naomi, which
Mhm.
means kind of pleasant or things are pleasant,
Yeah.
pleasantness, to Mara, and then
And
back to Naomi, right?
I think she really saw wealth as important as for who she is.
Mm.
And once that things change, suddenly she's Naomi, Again, Ruth means friend or companion. Boaz from two words, and him is strength. Yeah.
So we kind of see this, right? The house of bread is no longer the house of bread. Elimelech, my God is king, dies. That character. Sickness and pestilence then
Mhm.
die, and Naomi becomes Mara, bitterness. Pleasantness becomes bitterness, and then everything comes back. The house of bread is the house of bread again.
Yeah.
Naomi is rejoicing again, has an heir, has
Mhm.
a family, and it all turns on Ruth and committing Naomi, right?
I do have to say, one of the things that just fascinates me about Ruth, the story of Ruth, of course, she is mentioned in Matthew's genealogical history of Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
which begins with Abraham, but primarily with David. And there are 4 women that are mentioned. And Luke doesn't mention any woman in his genealogy of Jesus, but each of the 4 women that are mentioned as mothers because they were either Gentiles and or because they had to go out of the norm, break social, political, gender laws to do what they needed to do to have the children that were necessary for God's work to happen, including prostitute themselves with a father-in-law, save the Israelites from destruction
Right.
by going against her own people. And all of that, and Mary herself is that 4th woman. Now, we know so little about Mary, but her birth obviously breaks convention.
Yeah.
And God has a way of loving the tricksters, people who are willing to go against the grain.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
in a way that we don't always acknowledge.
Like Jacob.
Like Jacob, exactly. Those
Connect back to
patriarchs.
the segment that our viewers will watch right before this one. We had been talking about Rahab. How is Boaz connected to Rahab? Do either of you know?
Yeah. Well, Rahab was, I have a cat wanting to enter here. Rahab was Boaz's mother, and she had recognized God as the God. He respected her for standing up for family was really the main thing. She was willing to risk her life to help the Israelites coming in to invade her city if her own family would be protected. And she was so clever with the whole thing and getting the people searching, hiding them on her roof, sending the army or people out. And then when they can't get back because the gates are locked, hanging her little red cord out the window as a sign, my family's all inside, we're safe, you can come now. I just think someone with a mother that went out, that was, I don't know what you call a renegade in so many ways, but also recognizing goodness and God and doing what she had the power to do. And that's what all of those women, I think, mentioned. There were women who, whatever, even if they had a little power, they did what they used that power to accomplish something that blessed many people. So yeah, she's pretty cool.
She is very cool. Yeah, she's like a modern day, one of the women that went into France were spies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jean, for you, how do you think being raised by Rahab would have made Boaz the kind of man who would step up in the end?
Oh my gosh, I think about all the families that have people who cross boundaries as their parents, and they're much more willing to be open to others who come from a different background or life situation. It can engender a sense of compassion and mercy. It can also appreciate a woman like Ruth who, snuck up during the middle of the night and got under his skirts.
Yep.
Yep.
And not condemn her right out of the box.
Right. He's raised by a prostitute. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that might have helped him be open. And, of course, his name is Strength. And here's this man of strength who comes from this woman of strength. And then there's Ruth, this, another character, another woman of strength. And it takes all of that kind of coming together to open the way for what God is going to do in the world.
And we don't know what kind of barriers she experienced when she did join the Hebrew community. But there must have been some prejudice. And I think of all the folks that are willing to stand up for immigrants, for those in third generation people who are advocates for those who have been left out, whatever the reason. I think that's just absolutely important.
How do both of you see pieces of Ruth in Jesus?
I think Ruth is everything we want God to be and God wants us to be. I don't know if you can assume that. The word most used in Ruth is hesed, which is also the word most used describing God in the Hebrew scripture. It just means steadfast love. And I love that. And she inspires me as going wherever we need to go, wherever we're called to go, and be following, but faithfully loving, still holding true to who you are, using resources, trusting God enough to know there will be resources provided. Go to the field, see what happens. If you don't go, you'll never know what happens. Doing the unexpected, and I think doing everything to make sure we make it home. Ram Dass's book, we're all walking each other home to a place of goodness and hope and a future that you can begin to imagine. And it's based on so much trust. I think it's often used maybe at stewardship time, which we're sort of in now too, because she says, where you go, I will go. Our pledges are for the future. Even when we make a financial pledge or a volunteer pledge, that we'll be able to do what we're called upon to do.
Right. Yeah. Right. How about for you, Jean?
I think all of the above. You did a great summary, Susan. The one piece for me that stands out in addition to all of that is being willing to take risk. And she didn't do it for herself. She did it for her mother-in-law. She wasn't trying to get power. She wasn't trying to sleep with a rich man to get rich or fame, or, she did it because it would save her family, her adopted family. And I think that's really important, that following Jesus it means taking risk, if you really do, on behalf of others.
Yeah, I really, in Ruth, I see this character who loves this woman who has given up on life, given up on herself, and she loves her and she walks by her side and is loyal and committed until there's new life again.
Mhm.
And I think you're right, Sue. I mean, that's what all of us long for God to do with us and in our life is love us when we've given up on ourselves and when we're, just don't see a way forward into new life, and kind of join us in the journey until finally there is. Well, as you think about opening the womb of the world for Jesus this year, how do you think we could be Ruth-like characters in our own time and place? Our time and place, of course, being this bizarre year of 2020.
I think the journey that we're on, and I've been working on to become anti-racist is absolutely exactly what this is about. And crossing those boundaries and seeing everyone on each side of the boundaries as someone with worth and dignity, and advocating,
Stepping out there for others, like
taking the risks. Yeah.
taking the risks for someone else, not for yourself. Yeah, for someone else. Beautiful.
And I think just there are so many ways from our own little individual lives to out in the world. And I think of so many people in Florida are not native Floridians, and we've all come here from somewhere else. And often we have to leave stuff behind, not just all the furniture that you see in storage places, but, sometimes our contacts with families, sometimes the way we always used to do things, you can't do that anymore. I'm at an age, retired now, I guess 8 years. I mean, that's a whole new journey. And finding after a while, there's certain things you do leave behind, but what are you still empowered to do? And do you dare to do? This story is so rich. I think Ruth and God are calling us all in so many ways. And the big trick is the listening each step of the way, as she did. What now? Where do I go now? What do you want me to do? I will go where you lead.
I was thinking about Harold, this week after we learned about his death, and and about you, Sue, who really followed a path that, I was in this presbytery when Harold was brought up on charges for being willing to ordain GLBTQ folk. And he stood his ground. And you followed in his footsteps against really awful odds. And have embodied, as Jen has continued, how to build a beloved community.
And there were people like you, and there were some others, as we were brought up on charges. There were people there standing with us. We weren't alone. They weren't always the loudest voices that everybody saw, but that was wonderful knowing we had that support.
For me, even, and of course, when you were walking that journey, I was just the beginning of my kind of seminary time and entering, listening to that call to ministry and trying to enter that. And I know for me, there were times where, very much like Naomi, I kind of gave up. So there's just not a way forward. And there were people who, kind of in my despair or hopelessness, held hope for me and journeyed alongside me until God's way became clear. And I think, particularly when I think of that, I think of right now how many people are losing hope, and I think of our volunteers right now in our food pantry, and here come these gleaners needing that bread, needing that food, and they're offering those bags of hope and just journeying alongside people until things shift, things change. And then there's the folks like Jean in the background, working to really change the justice piece of all of it, so that aren't there in the first place. Well, thank you both for this beautiful conversation about the book of Ruth. I know we could go on and on about Ruth. It's just this wonderful piece that we often miss of the Christmas story that really, especially when you're reading the Christmas story in Matthew's gospel, you don't get the full thing unless you go back to some of these stories. So
that's right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you for joining us for Advent Conversations as we continue on the journey of this season.